Good morning to all from the editorial board of Build-Up Portal. For the ones who are attending a Build-Up webinar for the first time, welcome. For our returning audience, thank you all for renovating your interest. It is a pleasure to host today's webinar entitled Assessing the Energy Performance of a Building, Put Energy Efficiency First, which is organized in collaboration with EuroACE. I would like to invite you all to contribute and participate to this webinar. You can ask questions by typing in the box on the right side of the screen. They will be answered at the end of the presentations. You can also contribute to Build-Up Portal. Build-Up is a collaborative platform in the field of energy efficiency. It is continuously updated and it represents one of the key sources of information on the topic of energy efficiency. You can register and become a member of the community. You can also upload news, events, present a case study, results from a project, and so on. I would like to invite you all to navigate the portal. Here, in the Learn section, you will find all the podcasts of the past webinars, so it is possible to listen to all the previous presentations. Now, I would like to leave the microphone to Hélène Sibilot from EuroACE. She will be presenting the agenda and she will be moderating the webinar. Please, Hélène, we can start the session.
Thank you, Linda, for the introduction. It is my pleasure to welcome you all as well to this webinar. It is the fourth and the last of a series that EuroACE is organizing in cooperation with Build-Up in order to promote our guide to EPBD implementation. Today's topic, how to assess the energy performance of a building, putting energy efficiency first. But first, who is EuroACE? We are the European Alliance of Companies for Energy Efficiency in Buildings. We represent 14 members, which are leading companies involved in the manufacture, distribution, and installation of a variety of energy-saving goods and services. Together, they employ 286,000 employees in more than 1,300 factories and office locations in Europe. Why do we exist? We advocate for ambitious EU policies for energy efficiency in buildings. This is to bring benefits to all citizens and businesses through improved energy performance of buildings, and of course to increase the markets for the products, equipment and services offered by our member companies. So what do we work on exactly? We work, of course, on the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, including the development of the Smart Readiness Indicator. We also work on the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Governance Regulation. And besides, we follow the discussion on the EU 2050 strategy for a climate neutral economy and are involved in dossiers linked to financing energy efficiency. On the EPBD, why developing a guide? Having followed the revision since its first step and throughout the negotiations, we wanted to set out our views for the transposition and implementation phase. We wanted to share our knowledge, our experience, and provide some recommendations. These recommendations are addressed at member state officials, regional, local authorities, but also other stakeholders and private actors in order to inform them about the amended EPBD and motivate them to implement ambitious policies at national level. What was our approach? You can see on the slide on the EuroACE guide was long and inclusive. We started back in December 2017, when the political negotiations ended, to identify which key aspects to cover in the guide. After consultation with our own members, we invited expert reviewers, including the Commission, as well as other stakeholders to input and comment on our draft. We finally launched our guide last November during our first webinar with Build-Up. We held 3 webinars already, the first on the long-term renovation strategies, the second on building renovation passports and financing, and the third on smart and technology-equipped buildings. To briefly present the guide, it contains 12 high-level recommendations and is structured in 6 chapters. The first chapter gives an overview of the main changes brought by the amended EPBD and is then followed by 5 thematic chapters. A chapter on national long-term renovation strategies, a chapter on building renovation passports, a chapter on financing energy renovation and the link to improved energy performance, a chapter on smart and technology-equipped buildings, And finally, a chapter on how to describe the energy performance of a building, putting energy efficiency first, on which we will focus today. This is it from my side for a quick introduction and overview of the EuroACE guide to EPBD implementation. Let me remind you again that you can ask questions to speakers in a dedicated box. We will answer them in a dedicated session after the 3 presentations. And now we can move on to the core of today's topic with the first presentation by Adrian Joyce. Adrian is Secretary General of EuroACE. He's also the campaign director of the Renovate Europe campaign. He will present the chapter of the EPBD guide dedicated to today's topic. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helene. And I wanted to start by saying a big thank you to the Build Up platform for this series of webinars. We've had great support in putting these together, and to my colleagues from the office, particularly Helen, who's been a great support. So welcome all of you to this webinar. I'm pleased to introduce to you the subject of Chapter 6, which, as Helen mentioned, is how to describe the energy performance of a building, putting energy efficiency first in the methodologies that are based on the Annex I requirements. So let me start by asking the question, what is Annex I? Well, it's a general framework for calculating the energy performance of buildings that has been in the Buildings Directive since its earliest iteration. And it's a methodology that must be used by the member states when they are devising their own national methodologies in order to describe energy performance certification and compliance with minimum energy performance requirements. So on these 2 points, I remind the audience that energy performance certification is a requirement whereby every building on leasing, renting or sale must be provided with a performance certificate that describes on a scale of A to G, usually, the energy performance of the building. And that is a calculated performance based on the methodologies we're discussing this afternoon, and must be, as I said, provided at those critical moments in the life of a building. The minimum energy performance requirements are those set at each national level for buildings' performance in order to meet regulations. And those minimum energy performance requirements, many of you will recall, are tested against the so-called cost optimality methodology because they must comply with cost optimality. The other thing that the general framework sets down is that the result of the methodology must be expressed in primary energy using the units of kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So that's a requirement, but member states can choose to have additional indicators as well, but they must at least have the primary energy in kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So why is the annex important? The intention behind the annex is to provide transparency to stakeholders on the calculation methodologies used by the member states. And that transparency is important for actors in the field so that they can compare across regions and across countries how various different buildings perform, one compared to another, say within a single typology such as hotels. It's also important because it forms the basis for member states' own evaluations and reporting on how they're complying with the Buildings Directive and the various technical elements within the directive. And what we see in the new revised or amended Annex I is that member states are now required to use the overarching standards for when they're describing their methodologies. And we will have more on this from YAP very shortly. We feel that the comparisons between member states, which are a result of using these methodologies only to a certain extent, is giving us the level of comparability that we wish, and this would be maybe a criticism that we would have of the methodologies, is that there are so many methodologies that are used at the present time that comparability between member states is difficult. So let's look more precisely at what has changed within the amendments for Annex I of the Buildings Directive. We now see that the member states must calculate performance to optimize health, indoor air quality and comfort. And this emphasis on those three elements of well-being is new. There's also a new statement that requires member states to ensure the optimal performance of the building envelope. And from a EuroACE perspective, this is a good thing because it is reducing the overall energy demand of the buildings in Europe. That's the most important thing that we're working towards. And it is within an efficiently operating envelope that the best available equipment and controls function. So having this emphasis on improving the energy performance of the envelope is a very good measure in order to get a really highly energy efficient and a higher chance of a decarbonized building stock by 2050. What's new as well is in the previous version of the directive, it was kind of optional that member states could take account of certain aspects. Now they must, it's an obligation to take account of certain aspects, which we have listed here. There are 5 listed: local solar exposure, active solar and other RES systems, cogeneration, district and block heating and cooling, and natural lighting. And these 5 positive elements are ones that really have to be taken into account at design stage in the building. So orientation, microclimate, the exposure to sun in order to get energy through renewable systems. It is good news that member states are now obliged to take these aspects into account, as it will lead to better building design and better energy performance of those buildings in time. In Annex I, we also see a discussion on how renewable energy systems should be treated. And renewable energy systems are, of course, those that do not call on the energy grids or on supplied fossil fuels, for example, gas or oil, in order to meet the needs of the occupants of the buildings. In the amended Annex I, we see that renewable energy sources must be treated in a non-discriminatory way. And I know that our speaker, Dimitrios from DG Energy, will address that topic in more detail. What's interesting is that the renewables on building do count towards the energy performance of the building, thus reducing demand on grids. And here we're happy to see that in the annex, the emphasis must first be on reducing the energy demand and then looking at renewables on the building. And that's how we see the annex has been written. And we see this as being very logical because it relates to the nearly zero energy building standard, definition. And by having this emphasis on improving the performance of the building first and then looking to the renewables element on the building, it is the logic of the nearly zero energy building definition that is included within the directive and was unamended during the recent changes to the directive. So when it comes to calculating in accordance with Annex I, what is the approach that one should adopt? The first thing that one has to do is to calculate the energy, and that is regardless of the source of the energy, that's needed for the building to perform as intended. And to perform as intended means that the functions for which the building was designed can be carried out safely inside the building, and that the occupants of the building are comfortable and that their health is not negatively impacted by being indoors so often. So the directive calls for the calculation to focus on certain key elements of the performance of the building, and we see those listed here: heating and cooling, hot water, ventilation, built-in lighting, and other technical building systems. So in taking all of these into account, we say in our guide that the member states should calculate that need overall, regardless of the source. And then there's a requirement to translate those needs into primary energy expressed in kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And once again, Jaap will look at this for us in more detail shortly. It's a useful approach because then it becomes easier to determine the proportion of renewables that are used from the building or indeed from the grid. And that can be calculated afterwards. And as I said earlier, you then have the declaration of the overall energy performance, which goes on the energy performance certificate. So what is the potential impact of these amendments to Annex I? Well, we have listed them here as opportunities and risks. The first opportunity is this link I've tried to discuss with the definition of the nearly zero energy buildings. Because by putting energy efficiency first and the emphasis on the building envelope, we should be able to drive down the energy demand first and then look to how we can supply that demand through, in the first case, renewables, and in the second case, other sources of energy. We do believe there's an opportunity for increased comparability across the EU, and this will rely, though, pretty heavily on how well and how thoroughly the member states use the new international standards that they're required to use. So they have that opportunity to use them more, and we will hear in detail about that shortly. The last opportunity we see is that there is an opportunity for this methodology to lead to increased comfort and health within buildings. And that emphasis is something we welcome very much in the amendments that have taken place to the Annex I. But there are risks, and for us the risks are that the comparisons may not be possible after all, and that depending on how the member states design and implement their own methodologies. If those changes that member states implement following the amendments to the directive are great, then there could be a discontinuity between the current methodologies and the current ways of expressing the energy performance of the building and the new or the future methods. And therefore, we feel there's a risk that the credibility of these methodologies could be undermined if the changes are too radical or not well explained as they're brought into force. So while overall we welcome the amendments to Annex I, we do see that there are some risks that come with the proposed changes. So I will look forward to speaking again later when the questions come rolling in, and do not be shy. We like answering questions at the end of our sessions. So I pass you back to the moderator, Helen.
Thank you, Adrian, for a clear presentation of the chapter and the EuroACE position. Now we're on to Dimitrios Athanasiou, who is Policy Officer in DG Energy in the European Commission. He will give the perspective of policymakers on the topic. Dimitrios, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would also like to thank Build Up for and EuroACE for all its efforts, the effort they've done to promote and to support the EPBD, not just the revised EPBD, but in general all the ambitions that the improvement of energy performance of buildings might bring to the energy union. It is also very important for us to be here present and also have the opportunity to take the floor and present our interpretation of the revised EPBD, which is done through our guidance documents. The whole process of the revision of the EPBD started many years ago, I would say even before November 2016, by the evaluation and the impact assessment of the directive, and it has been decided to be part of the so-called Clean Energy for All Europeans package launched November 2016, and through a big process, a huge process of negotiations and with stakeholders, with council, with member states, and with the parliament, we managed to have the revised directive, an amending directive published and entered into force in July, published in June 2018, and then entered into force 20 days later. And what is important now is for member states to properly transpose it, and the deadline for that is 10 of March 2020. In order to do so, the Commission started the process of preparing and developing guidance documents, 6 of them, which are related with all more or less the revised provisions on long-term innovation strategies, on electromobility, on technical building systems, on articles 14 and 15 regarding the inspection of heating systems and cooling systems, and self-regulating devices, but also on the topic that we discussed today on Annex I and the calculation methodology. The guidance documents are, we were planning to publish them by the end of March, but it is a long process with interservice consultations, with legal and linguistic controls, and also the official translation of them into all member states' languages. So we think that soon enough, within a month or two, they will be published, well advanced for member states to review them, to consider them in view of their transposition. So the outcome of all this negotiation was a strengthened directive, which we have to admit it is more ambitious than the original Commission's proposal. So now we have stronger long-term innovation strategies that member states have to develop, and they have to do so as part of the national energy and climate plans. So we expect long-term innovation strategies to be already considered in the final national energy and climate plans by the end of next year, despite the fact that the deadline is for member states to develop long-term innovation strategies is 10th of March 2020, the transposition of the deadline. But still, it is very important to already consider all the elements of these strategies that are necessary in order to contribute to the general energy efficiency target. The directive also provides an optional scheme for the smart readiness indicator. It provides targeted provisions for electromobility infrastructure related to the recharging parking slots. It also promotes and reinforced building automation and control systems through many different provisions, and of course it is Annex I. It is also revised to provide, as we will see later, more transparency to the calculations. So Annex I was actually revised. Annex I provides us, Adrian just mentioned before, Annex I is about some general and common framework for the calculation of the energy performance of buildings. So it is the calculation of energy performance is at the core of the directive, and the Annex I only tries to make it to provide the general rules or how member states should think of these calculations. So the intention for the revised EPBD to review Annex I was actually to provide more clarity, to provide to member states more guidelines on how they should calculate it, and to also highlight some more factors to be considered, such as health, indoor and air quality and comfort levels, as well as the consideration of the building envelope, and of course primary energy factors and treatment of renewables. We see, and this is how we have actually structured our guidance document on Annex I. We see that we can discuss all these revised provisions in 3 major blocks, and one of them is related with the new obligations for member states to describe their national calculation methodology following the national annexes of the overarching standards. So this is not about asking member states to mandatory use the standards. The standards will remain on a voluntary basis for member states to comply with them fully or not, depending on their national methodology. So it's not, again, Annex I and its revision is not about asking member states, requiring member states to harmonize their calculation methodologies. We only ask for more transparency, and in order to see how all the different calculation methodologies across the member states can be actually compared, and then through this exercise maybe we can see what can be improved, what can be, let's say, harmonized, but on a very gradual and future step. It's not the discussion now. We only ask for transparency and comparability in order to see what is really happening, and we ask member states to do so by reporting to the Commission their calculation methodologies by using a specific template, which is the template of the national annexes of the overarching standards. So by gathering all this data, then we can see where member states can converge and where the biggest, let's say, differences are, and how we can proceed further. So the second block of provisions is related with how we determine and how we express the energy performance. So these provisions are not entirely new, but there are more elements there trying to make the annex, let's say, more transparent. So it is clear that now the energy performance of a building must be determined on the basis of the calculated or the actual energy use. It is clear, the energy uses of a building are revised a little bit in order to comply with the new definitions of technical building systems as well. And then it is now clear that the energy performance must be expressed by an indicator which is primary energy use in kilowatt hours per square meter per year, and this indicator must cover both the energy performance certification and compliance with minimum energy performance requirements. additional requirements may be also be considered. In addition, I have to highlight this. In addition to this primary energy use indicator, in order to better describe the building's energy performance. So what member states have to actually do is to revise their calculation methodologies so far and see, or their legislation, because this is not only about the methodology, but they also have to revise their building codes and see if there is room for improvement, because they now have to make sure that all these aspects that I mentioned before have to be respected. So in the guidance documents, we provide a little bit of extra, let's say, comments, which were in order to reflect specific questions by member states. For example, what is the case if they use, and this is also related to what Adrian mentioned before as one of the risks that the revised annex might bring. So what if, for example, member states, they already use another approach, a dimensionless approach that they compare the primary energy use with a reference building. So how would that be, let's say, confront? The answer is that they have to describe it. I mean, it's a case-by-case situation here, and in any case, member states have to describe how this dimensionless approach relates with the primary energy use. So we have to see on a case-by-case scenario what the issue is, but it has to be clear that this indicator has to be somehow related with primary energy use. We have already examined a couple of situations, and I think that in any case, member states will find a solution also in relation with these additional indicators that might also member states can also consider. So another something that Adrian mentioned, and it is not very easy from the first glance for everybody to realize, that there is, as Andrea said, now the annex provides for a more holistic approach related with the methodology for the calculation, exactly by just deleting this where relevant in the calculation related with extra conditions like solar conditions, electricity produced by cogeneration, district heatings, and natural lighting. So, as Adrian just mentioned before, now it is not up to member states to consider those extra and very important for the methodology extra aspects, but they have to do that. They really have to take into account the solar conditions, natural lighting, and even trying to reflect on conditions by member states. Even this is not common in some cases, they still have to see what is there. And of course, if, for example, there is no, for example, district heating, well-developed district heating in a country, then this has to be at least considered and see, is there room, for example, to make a link with district heating solutions to develop also in relations with the other directives like the ED and the renewables directive. So it's a big discussion, but the idea is that now member states have to consider those additional factors. So the third big block of, I must say, well debated during the trialogues points have to do with primary energy factors and not only. So briefly to mention that primary energy factors it is clear that it is responsibility for member states to determine and to define. This is clear. The revised EPBD in Annex I tried to do is to provide more clarity on how these are calculated, because it is true that the values differ significantly among member states, and the problem is that it is not at all transparent how are these factors, the primary energy factors, are finally determined. Again, it is not the intention of the revised EPBD to interfere with member states' competence on how to define primary energy factors, but it is only about improving transparency, comparability, and making the methodologies easier for everyone to understand. So there are some. The directive provides some flexibility on how to define primary energy factors. I mean, this is common. That was already the case before, but now it is clearly defined that this could be based on national or regional or even local weighted average, or annual or seasonal, and on other more specific. So it builds on what feedback we received already from stakeholders and from the discussion with the member states. Energy needs, which is also on the core of our discussion today. It is very important because indeed it's the starting point of the calculation methodology, at least how, I mean, in relation with the standards and with the cost optimal methodology. So energy needs are very important because they have to be covered by the calculation methodologies, and the most important thing is that now it's not only about reflecting on the energy needs, but also on the comfort, indoor air quality, and health conditions. So those levels are determined by member states, but now the methodology must make sure that the energy needs also cover all these needs, all the comfort levels and all the indoor air quality. So we provide some more technical elements related with comfort levels, standards in the guidance documents. But this is very important for all member states to understand and to actually provide more realistic, also in terms of comfort energy needs. And with regards to the discussion about putting energy efficiency first, which it is also related with the broader, let's say, political agenda of putting energy efficiency first, and it's not only about the building. So I have to mention that the Clean Energy for All Europeans package also it is very important to say that it is on the top of this political discussion, and now the outcome of this package is that there is a clear definition in the governance regulation about putting energy efficiency first and what this is. In few words, it is about asking all other policies to also consider energy efficiency dimension before implementing their own individual actions and policy measures and so on. This is very, very important because, and I think it was during another EuroACE workshop that our head of unit mentioned that we usually tend to say that we like energy efficiency, it is high in the political agenda, but then we don't necessarily do the actions to support and promote it on the ground. So it is very important that the Clean Energy for Europeans package starts from this point and makes it clear. It is important that we have a definition there, and it is also important from the building's perspective that the energy efficiency must always be pursued. This is very important because, as Adrian said before, it reduces the energy demand of the buildings and then from the building stock in general, and thus allows us to easier achieve our energy efficiency targets. It is also related with other systems of the building that can easily be, can better be optimized. And it is also important that, because there was some criticism about the revised EPBD, that it wasn't building a lot on the envelope and it was only about smartness and technical building systems, but I have to mention that the revised EPBD was, let's say, developed based on targeted amendments and leaving other provisions that would in any case provide untouched. So EPCs or cost optimal methodologies, all this, the basic architecture of the EPBD remained attached because it was already delivering. Not having so many provisions on envelope in the envelope doesn't mean that the EPBD doesn't care about anymore. On the contrary, it is because they deliver well, they remained attached. But it is very important that we have this provision there, which we see that in any case, member states have to always seek for the best combination of energy efficiency and renewables measures, and always they have on a specific, let's say, case by case scenarios, they have to find always the best solution. And so renewables, on-site and off-site renewables. This is that was also very well debated. It was a big discussion on how renewables should be treated. The question now is how they should be treated when calculating the primary energy factors. So again, we have to start by member states' flexibility to take into account renewables if they want. But if they do so, they have to respect the non-discriminator basis, which in other words could be translated that comparable situations must not be treated differently and different situations must not be treated in the same way. I mean, there is a big discussion over it. What we would like to say is that renewables is a good thing, of course. It improves the energy performance of the building, and of course it reduces the primary energy associated with the delivery of the energy. So since we express energy performance in primary energy use, so it plays a role, but as we said before, it has always to, we always have to consider renewables together with energy efficiency measures in the envelope and in other technical building systems. So that was all from my side. It's a very technical issue, and we will be in any case working closely with stakeholders and the member states, and especially now where the deadline for nearly zero energy buildings is approaching. It's already came for public buildings, but now we try to see how member states perform on that. We're also reviewing the second cost optimal reports that member states delivered last year. So all this together with other studies related with the building passports, with the smart indicator, with the standards, all this will be, let's say, in the core work that we do in the Commission at this period. Thank you very much again, and I'm happy to take any questions later. Thanks.
Thank you, Dimitris, for a thorough presentation. And now we are moving on to Jaap Holing, who is director of the EPP Center based in the Netherlands. He will give some insights on his work and explain how to use the set of energy performance of building standards at national level for the calculation methodologies. And Jaap, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your nice introduction, and thank you to the Build-Up platform and EuroACE to invite me for this presentation. What I want to say is a few words around rolling out the set of EPBD standards and how to support the use of these EPBD standards at national level. Next slide, I give you the background. As many of you know, that in December 2010, the European Commission gave a mandate to develop a consistent set of standards to assess the overall energy performance of buildings. This is a set of standards, what we called the second generation, because there was an earlier set developed before that. And this to support the implementation of the EPBD and for the purpose of energy performance certification of existing buildings and checking the compliance against minimum energy performance requirements of new buildings. The set should focus on harmonized procedures, and the word harmonized is then in the sense that all the procedures we give have to be interconnected in a proper way, but written in such a way that it offers all flexibility for national or regional situations. And next slide, I say a few words on the holistic approach. The essence is that we do not look anymore at the products we use to build buildings and to build installation as products as such, but as an overall integrated system. So from the boundary conditions at the bottom and the component product characteristics, we go to the energy need calculations, energy use, and finally the energy performance as expressed in the overarching standards 52000. So from climate conditions to energy needs to technical building systems and energy ratings. Next slide, I say something about the current status. Many of you will know that all standards have been published meanwhile. Last year, and it was the last standard that is now out. In total, 53 standards. 17 of them are also ISO standards, and in the 52000 family, and 36 are just European standards, but we will also try to bring them to ISO level as well. Connected to the standards are 39 technical reports, because the standards, they contain normative text and all text on the justification, background information, and also calculation examples are included in technical report to make the experience also accessible for people who were not involved in the creation process of the standards. Now, I think the next step is implement those standards in national building regulations. Of course, as Dimitrios from DG Energy says, it is not a requirement for the member states to use these standards, but in Article 3 of the EPBD, it is, you could say, at least encouraged to use them as the basis of the national procedures. And even stronger, in the Annex I of the EPBD, there is a new obligations for the member state to describe their national calculation methodology following the annexes of the 5 overarching type of standards. I will come back to that later. In the next slide, I try to show, well, without mentioning 53 standards, what the holistic approach and also what the modular structure of the set of standards means. It means that from the top, where you see standards on heat gains, on building properties, on climatic conditions and indoor environment, these standards deliver the input for the energy need calculations. The energy need calculation is described in EN ISO 52016-1. This standard describes, you could say, it is the core of the system, describes what is the need for cooling, ventilation, heating, domestic hot water, and lighting from the energy need calculation. Then the set of standards on the systems, you see in the columns cooling, ventilation, heating, and domestic hot water and lighting. They describe the calculation procedure, how to calculate the energy use of those systems to satisfy those needs. And of course, taking into account building automation and system control, which has to connect the different systems to achieve the indoor environment required. Finally, this energy use has to be expressed in primary energy terminology, and this is described in the overarching standard 52000-1. And in this standard EN ISO 52003, we give also procedures how to express it in partial energy performance indicators and how to report this sort of data in the form of an energy certificate, which, well, has not to be followed precisely in but so if we see around in Europe, we see different sorts of certificates as pictures they are different, but they should at least include this sort of information as described in these standards. In the next slide, I try to give just an overview of the matrix of the module structure. The matrix is much bigger, so you see only a part of it, and each standard includes in one of the first pages this matrix and shows that one of the empty boxes is filled in by this standard, and it describes also how it is interconnected with the other boxes, just to illustrate the modular structure of the set of 53 EPB standards. In the next slide, I want to say a few words on the flexibility. It is a harmonized modular set, consistent and transparent package of standards, written that it should be fit in the context of the regulations that you have on national level, but also we know that it should be flexible. And there are clearly identified options And national data are necessary because of the fact that we have different climates in Europe, different traditions, building typology, and legal frameworks for national building regulations and policy. So those factors are flexible. I will come back to that later. And the next, I say, well, how to implement these standards? All the standards have an Annex A and Annex B. I don't go too much in the Annex B. The Annex B is a filled-in Annex A, where all the typical choices, levels of simplifications, and values that you have to agree on national level have been filled in for a more European approach. Annex B is added to all the standards to make it possible to use a standard without first deciding on all the boundary conditions and levels of simplification, and is an excellent example how to use the standards for pan-European procedures like European voluntary certification schemes and that sort of approaches. But Annex A is, you could say, an Annex B without any numbers and any choices. And there, the member state, the national regulator or the national standard body can fill in how they apply this procedure in their national context. In the next slide, I go a little bit in why this flexibility of national annexes is required. Examples for typical national choices are the climatic data, the policy factors, let's say about the primary energy conversion, or building categories, space categories, how to consider this set of user conditions in their environmental parameters per space, a choice between detailed or simplified procedures for existing buildings and new buildings, for residential, non-residential. It can all be different. Default choices for specific components or products, and perhaps a replacement of a specific EPB standards by national procedure to enable a step-by-step approach on national level. This is the flexibility. Next slide, I want to say a few words on the role of the EPB Center based on the service contract we have with DG Energy to support the dissemination and rollout of the set of standards. We started in September last year, and this project will run for 3 years. And next slide. Next, we see the services we intend to deliver to the member states and the national standard bodies to complete the national annexes of the overarching type of standards mentioned in the Annex I of the EPBD, disseminate information and promote the use of the overarching standards, but also other standards, and information service for all involved stakeholders from industry to engineers and professional organizations and financial institutions who are involved in the work on EPB standards. In the next, we develop knowledge tools, frequent asked questions on key issues, questions on how to fill in the national annexes, of course, or how to use standards, or how to find my way, how to understand certain phrases in standards, or sometimes also questions on if there are perhaps typos or shortcomings in certain standards. We also give answers on that. We also produce calculation tools for key individual standards, case studies, and will organize hands-on workshops, offline training sessions, and webinar series. And next, I give you the overview of the overarching type of standards that are mentioned in in Annex I of the EPBD, and you see these standards are really dealing with the energy need and the overall approach, where the Vision 2000 also show the policy factors and how a member state is dealing with the share of renewables and the primary energy factors. And also an important part is the part 10 on the climatic data, where we solve the problem on the solar energy in a more detailed way. In the next, I show you that we are considering to develop case studies to demonstrate the usability of the standard. We look around in Europe across the 28 member states and the different climate zones. We think about examples for residential and non-residential, for real buildings. Partly these are partly case studies for certain aspects, but also some case studies for total buildings with simplified calculation procedures we want to disseminate. And on the next, I want to say a few words on the frequent asked questions. When placed on the website and communicated through e-letters, I and we expect it will trigger new questions, and we want to build the coming months a well-structured Q&A section on our website. And the only thing I can do at this moment is invite you to visit our website, which is currently upgraded in the coming weeks. So perhaps you want to come back later when it is fully upgraded. And the next slide, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm open for any questions as said by the previous speakers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jaap, for all the details on your work on the standards. Now we're going to start the Q&A session. I think we can extend a bit after 1:15 because we have a lot of questions and to have most of them answered. Before we start, I would just want to confirm that we will share both the recording and the slides from this webinar on our website as well. It will be available on the BuildUp website, so you can always go back to it. So to start the Q&A session, maybe a few questions for definition and clarification. I will direct that question to Dimitris and maybe to Adrian as well. A question is, what does optimal performance of building envelope exactly mean? Is it only a technical criteria? And then a cost issue, insulation versus renewables, is it taken into account? Dimitris?
Thank you very much, Helen. So, optimal performance of the building envelope. What is important to understand there is that the role of envelope is very important again, and it shouldn't be neglected. And I would also add that the EPBD is all about optimality. We see that in with regards to the cost optimal methodologies that member states have to deliver in order to establish their minimum energy performance requirements. We see relevant issues reflected to economic technical feasibilities asked in specific relations provisions, and in general I would say that the optimal energy performance should reflect a specific level of a building envelope performance, which refers to a behavior that optimizes in general the performance of a building. What I'm trying to say is that this specific wording also is a result of a huge negotiation process, but it refers actually to a specific performance of the envelope that, together with the rest of the measures, renewables, technical building systems, should optimize the performance of the building.
Thank you, Dimitris. Continuing on the kind of envelope and optimal performance of building envelope question, I have a question I think is more directed towards YAP. Participants saying that one envelope quality parameter which is important with an important impact is airtightness, which is not easy or possible to predict. How can it be taken into account for calculations? Yep.
Well, the airtightness of buildings can be assessed by measurement procedure. It's well, the person who asked the question is correct that it is not easy. In most countries, there are regulations to follow certain details to achieve good airtightness. The best way to guarantee that the airtightness is reached is to, as is done in several European countries, to require a test to prove the airtightness of a new building or a deeply renovated building. And that property is part of the input data for the calculation procedure. And then to achieve a good indoor air quality, you have to take care of the ventilation systems to be installed in a building. It can be a natural ventilation. That is not that is very often used, you could say, but the national standards have to describe which natural ventilation system will meet the ventilation requirements that are needed according to one of the EPBD standards, which is the 16798, the standard on indoor environmental input parameters, because in that standard we give at least a classification system for identifying the ventilation rate in buildings for energy calculations, and you have to meet these requirements based on mechanical or a combination between mechanical and natural ventilation systems. Then you can also meet the requirements from the EPBD, which describe that indoor air quality and comfort should be in line with the requirements. And another issue is that one of the problems with ventilation and one of the problems in the summertime is overheating of building. The 50/2016 describes also a procedure to calculate the possible overheating of buildings, and will express that in hours of overheating, which will require you to take actions either to better ventilate the building, so ventilative cooling is for some areas in Europe a possibility, or to install apart from solar protection also cooling systems when needed in those buildings. I hope this is answering the question.
Thank you, Jaap, for the good answer, very detailed. Actually, there is another question that is directed to you, and it's about daylight. The daylight standard. Could you tell more about a standard EN 17037?
Yes, well, this standard EN, you say EN 30. Oh yes, I remember the number. This standard gives you a very you can say simple approach on how you can assess the daylight factor of a building and take this into account in your energy calculation, because the daylight factor of a building will determine also the estimated hours you have to use the artificial lighting, which uses energy. So this standard is really meant to give a rough estimate of the daylight factor of a building, depending on the size and the positioning of the windows in the building, in the facade, and the depths of the rooms considered. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you, Jaap, for the additional answer. I have now more general questions. I think I will direct them to the three speakers. And someone is asking, what about comparing calculated energy performance with the real consumption afterwards? And a linked question, which is, are member states actually encouraged or even requested to monitor, to publish the actual energy consumption of a number of certified buildings in order to compare the reality with the calculated energy performance indicators? And I will first give the floor to Adrian.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, indeed, this question about calculated versus real consumption in buildings often arises during these technical discussions. And I fully understand why the directive asks for calculated approaches to be the dominant ones for reporting performance in buildings. And that is because the use patterns in buildings and the behavior of occupants varies considerably, depending even within very, very similar building typologies. So it is logical, in my view, from a policy making point of view, that you would require a calculated basis for certification. However, it doesn't take away from the fact that that can then be misleading in terms of understanding how energy demand over time will drop within the building sector. And so I think the questioner is right to bring up this idea that member states ought to be required to do some monitoring and to verify whether the calculated energy performance of the building stock is closely aligned with the improving energy performance of the building stock in real terms over time. So maybe I don't know if Demetrius has something from a policy perspective to add and help understanding on this topic.
Yeah, just allow me to mention that it is indeed very important, and there are many more and more stakeholders asking for real data on the building sector, especially those coming from the financial, let's say, perspective, because when it is for financial measures to be implemented, then it really makes sense the actual energy consumption of a building. So in that respect, in Article 10 of the revised EPBD, there is now a new point, point 6a, which asks member states to also include actual energy consumption of their buildings in the EPC databases. Actually, the wording is estimated or actual or measured, but the idea was initially in the discussion was again about providing more actual data on buildings. As Andrea says, this reflects a lot the behavioral approach of the user. And the final point is that at this stage, and again, for not disturbing the continuity, as you mentioned before, Adrian, of the established calculation methodologies, at this point we ask for both, and we try to ask for more and more actual consumption input to be provided.
Thank you, Dimitris. Jaap, do you want to answer as well on the comparison between calculated energy performance with real consumption?
Yes, I'm happy to say a few words. I support all the answers given before, especially when you look at the existing building stock. You could say that if you want to give a customized advice to a building owner about the measures to be taken, it is very wise to have measured values to compare it with a calculation and to see which measures are most cost effective and most effective for this user, because a part of the measures could also be advice about how to use the building, because sometimes energy is not used wisely because the building user owner is not aware of a certain unwise use. So that's one of the issues. But of course, the comparing measured values with calculated values is quite complex because it is not clear how you really want or measure the building. If you only look at the energy use of the building in terms of natural gas or electricity, then you have to be aware that in these figures there is also a lot of non-energy performance of buildings use for appliances, for all kinds of processes. So you have to separate all these data from the data for the building, and that is not a very easy task. So we try to give in several of the EPBD standards some guidance in that direction, but it is in practice not a simple task, and perhaps it is a task that can be covered in the future when you look to smart buildings and smart grids in buildings and around buildings where you can use more sophisticated IT technology to measure it in more detail, and that you can easily separate the energy used for heating, cooling, domestic hot water and lighting from the other energy uses in the building, which has nothing to do with the energy performance of the building as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaap, for the answer. And Dimitris on that wants to comment.
Just one small comment to add that the modernization of the directive, I mean, promotion of building automation and control systems and all technical building systems modernization is a step towards bridging this gap, maybe with automation systems taking control over more user intervention.
Thanks, Dimitris. Now we move on to maybe another aspect of the topic, which is health and well-being. And again, the question to maybe all three speakers, what does the framework propose in order to secure indoor air quality and thermal comfort when energy efficiency is applied, whether for new or refurbished buildings? And exactly what does indoor air quality consider? Adrian, maybe you want to start?
Thank you, Helen. And indeed, let me start at the end. What is indoor air quality in terms of energy performance? Well, it's an air that is good to breathe, that is at the right temperature and the right level of humidity, so that occupants of the building can feel healthy, alert, and well, literally, inside the building. So regulating that means that you have to ensure that these factors of warmth, humidity, and air quality in terms of pollutants are well regulated. And in this directive, it seems to me that what we are tackling are largely those environmental ones around comfort, heat, temperature and humidity, rather than the other ones around pollutants that may be in the air. I suppose the one that we will look at in terms of energy performance are carbon dioxide, because of course increased levels of carbon dioxide in a room lead to lower productivity and lack of concentration. So the ventilation systems which are regulated here in this directive come into play. I don't know, does Dimitris wish to add?
Just a couple of thoughts, Andrea. Thank you. I see that there is always more and more focus on these new aspects now with regards to buildings. After all, the EPBD, the directive, is now in place for more than, let's say, 18 years. So the energy performance and the traditional indicators, the savings or the kilowatt hours per square meter are more or less well considered one way or another. And now indoor air quality and health issues start to gain more and more focus on, let's say, the construction world. So it's a cross-cutting issue, an horizontal issue, not only related with DG Energy, but also with DG Environment, DG Growth. They all have similar, let's say, work done around these issues, while health is becoming more and more important. Also from financiers, that it's also an indicator that could let's say boost renovations, because sometimes it's not only always easy to convince people that it will pay back in terms of money, but it's also important to focus on the wider benefits that a renovation of a better improved building can bring. And there are many, let's say, studies now being implemented highlighting that there is a link between better performing building and health issues. But I was only trying to mention, to reflect that it's a topic that it's gonna be more and more on the table.
Jaap, do you want to comment on how to secure indoor air quality and thermal comfort?
Yes, I support all the things mentioned before by the other two speakers, but I also want to refer to the European standard EN 16798-1. Energy performance of buildings is one of the EPBD standards, part 1 on indoor environmental input parameters for design, assessment of energy performance of buildings, indoor air quality, thermal environment, lighting and acoustics. This standard gives a classification procedure for identifying the indoor environment. In annexes of these standards, there is also a reference to the requirements or guidelines that are given by the World Health Organization on substances that are inside buildings, so indoor health requirements from the World Health Organization and other information. So I could only advise those who are interested to specify this indoor health aspect although this standard is not specific about health, but more about comfort and the related, of course, productivity to comfort. But health issues are also mentioned in an informative annex to show that there are figures in the World Health Organization. We agree, and there are also guidelines in other places in Europe. So I can only advise people to look at this standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaap, for redirecting us to that. Maybe one last question. It's a difficult one, but maybe if speakers can try to do it quickly. It's about the link between the PEF, so the primary energy factor, and the optimization of the energy performance of the building envelope. In the EPBD, it says that the PEF, or the weighting factors, shall be defined by member states. And in the application of those factors to the calculation, member states shall ensure the optimal performance of the building envelope. The person who asks the question says that the PEF actually should be what they should be, independently of the importance of the optimal envelope. So just maybe a reflection on that. And Dimitrios, to start.
Thank you very much. So, it is true that, yes, it is for member states to define primary energy factors. Nobody says the opposite. But the idea here is when member states determine with their own rules and conditions, and based on national conditions, regionals, or the energy mix, this PEF, they should always consider what these actual values will bring to the energy performance methodology. So this is what it is asked, so that they should never forget the role on the envelope. So it's not about defining a new, let's say, procedure for member states on how to calculate the PEF. No, we ask them to also consider the final outcome that this value would have on the energy performance, and how this could be combined on the best alternative, let's say, solution with the building envelope, which shouldn't be neglected in any case. So this is what it's all about.
Thanks, Demetrius. To me, this question relates back to the first question about optimal approaches. And what I realize in thinking about Annex I and the methodologies is that each part of the methodology affects every other part. And so if you switch one, or you use a dial to switch a PEF up or down, you impact the overall result. And that impact might lead you to take decisions on, for example, the building envelope or on air tightness levels, etc., that are not appropriate. And so I think the message, probably, at least how I understand it, is member states must realize that this is an interconnected methodology across different factors, and that each factor has a significant impact on the end result. So you must have equilibrium and balance and really good justifications behind each factor that you use in this methodology in order to deliver an optimum result, meaning one that delivers health, comfort, well-being, and cost effectiveness across the lifetime of the building. So yeah, a complex issue, but I think this last question relates right back to the first question.
Thank you, Adrian. And I will now actually draw the Q&A session to an end. My apologies for the questions we did not have the time to answer. I tried to give a bit more time to the Q&A, but we are already running up late. I would like, before closing, I would like to thank the build-up team for making this webinar possible and managing the technicalities. Thank, of course, our three speakers, Adrian, Dimitris, and Jaap. Thank as well to Chiara, who helped me managing the questions coming in. And finally, thank our audience. So you who are listening and who asked relevant questions, we will make sure to answer all the ones that came in also in written form on our website. because I think the questions make the webinar as well very interesting, and we had a good exchange. With that, I close the webinar, and I wish you all a very nice day and a very nice week.